All right, here we go. Next video, just to kind of pick up where we left off. This is the site where we left off, and we got our columns in, and we're looking pretty decent. We just got to kind of add our footer. Well, we got to add one more row in our footer. But what I want to do is I want to style up our site to look more like um, this site here. It looks a little different than the last video because I added a bit to the design. So it won't be a perfect match, but we will do the best we can. Um, so the first thing I want to do is um, I want to start with some global styles. So let's do some typography, and then we'll move on from there. So let's start with adding some custom fonts. So the custom font I'm going to use throughout this thing, just because I've used it so often, is a font called Lato. So I'm just going to Google fonts Lato, and I am going to show you how to integrate this into your site. So I'm going to click select this font after we get to the Lato page, and I am going to customize it. I want the light version and the bold version. So I want light, regular, and bold of this font, and I'm going to click here on this @import. Okay. I'm going to copy just this line, not the style, but just this line. And then I'm going to jump back into my style sheet. This is what our style sheet should look like. I'm going to go at the very top, and I'm going to save it. So we've basically imported this font into our website. So now we have access to this font. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a comment in my style sheet to clean it up, and you can kind of follow along if you want. And I'm going to call this global styles. Global styles means styles just across the whole site, not for a specific section of the site. So we'll start at the top with global styles. And what I like to do is I just like to set my elements, my headings. I like to just set the font family on my headings to whatever I want my font. So I'll set my font family to Lato. So we put that in single quotes. And then we put a comma, and then we set a backup default. So if for some reason Google Fonts is down or it's not loading properly, it will load a sans serif font as a backup. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back into my index and see if that changed anything. So it didn't. It looks like it didn't change anything. This is an H1 tag, and it's still the default Bootstrap typography. And there's a couple reasons why this is happening. And the main reason is we're loading our style sheet after the Bootstrap style sheet. So what's weird is style sheets will load in the reverse order they appear, which is counterintuitive. But we're going to move our style sheet, style.css. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to move that after we load the Bootstrap style sheet in our head. So I've just moved it from before to after, and it should load our styles before Bootstrap styles. And it did, right? So you can see this is now the Lato font in the headings. We can choose a different font if you guys want. Let's just do that real quick. Let's choose Lato and for headings, and then maybe we'll just choose Open Sans for text. So I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to customize. I'm just going to use regular. I'm not going to customize for Open Sans. And I'm just going to grab this entire thing again, this @import, and I'm just going to replace it. Let me word wrap so we can see that. Okay, so what we're doing is we've imported both Lato and the three versions of it, 300, 400, and 700. That's the font weight, and Open Sans. So in our global styles, I'm going to set all paragraphs, lists, and anchor tags to Open Sans. Open Sans, and then my backup will be any sans serif font. Okay, so we're just setting up our global styles here. And let's see if that worked. Yeah, so this is now Open Sans, and this is now Open Sans. Perfect. The other thing I want to do is we'll do a little bit of responsive font sizing. I won't explain it too much, but we will set on our HTML element a font size of 16 pixels. And I'll kind of explain that as we go along. That shouldn't change anything. Yep, perfect. Okay, so our global styles are in place for our typography at least, which as you can see really actually changes the look and feel of the site quite a bit. The other thing that Destiny pointed out is that there seems to be this horizontal scroll here, right? You might have noticed this, but there's this horizontal scroll, and the reason why that's happening is Bootstrap, if you're using the Bootstrap grid system, it requires you to put it inside of a container. So Bootstrap has a default class called container, and so what we'll do is we'll go right after the body opens, and we'll add that class. And then I'm going to indent the entire site. You don't have to do this, but I'm a control freak. So I'm going to open the entire, I'm going to open container right after the body. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom. And right before the body closes, I'm going to close my container. And I'm going to comment, this is where my container closes. Okay? So basically, we're wrapping the entire website in this class called container. Basically, the container puts some margins on the left and the right. Okay? So you're probably wondering, that looks bad because there's a lot of room on the left and right here. Bootstrap has an additional class called container-fluid, which will let you stretch all the way to the edges. There's still a little bit of margin, but it fixed that horizontal scroll, which is great. And we can take care of that little bit of margin later. Okay, so all that to say, we just needed to add a container fluid around the entire website, and that fixed it for us. Okay. All right, so let's just work. We're just going to work through one by one some of this more advanced stuff, right? So obviously, this looks different than this, and I swapped out the hero image. The client wanted a different one. But either way, it looks different. So let's start with like this cool rhombus thing, or at least I think it's cool, and this tagline, and sort of like trying to center up some of this this text, right? So right now, it's just by default top left corner, right? So it's just in the top left corner of this div. And to just remind us, this div is called div class hero, and then we've got this tagline and this link, this call to action. Okay, so let's do a couple things. So one thing we can do is we can actually put this thing in a Bootstrap column and kind of use Bootstrap to help us. So inside of hero, I'm going to create a column, a Bootstrap column, and I'm going to make it about half the width of the page. And I'm going to always comment, this is where my column closes. And I'm going to make it about half the width of the page. That's because this looks like it's about half the width of the page, the text. So we'll go column MD6 and make it half the width of the page. It shouldn't change much. But one thing we can do then is we can look and we can see this is kind of pushed over a bit. And so we can use that offset class that we learned in the last video to push it over, right? So if we do offset MD We'll start with 2 and see how that looks. And that pushes it over 2 columns. It looks like it's maybe a little too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to offset MD1. Perfect. I think that's perfect. So that's perfect. So we've got this in a column MD6 and it's offset by 1. The only thing is, and to just kind of, again, re-explain how the breakpoints work. So let me pull up Bootstrap for breakpoints and see if I can't. There we go. So if we add this MD marker here, basically anytime the screen is at 768 pixels or less, whatever our style is will go away, which is great because for most responsive sites, if we want things in columns, when it's really wide, as it gets smaller, we typically want these things to stack, right? So these things are now stacked on top of each other. They're no longer column MD6s, they're no longer column 6s because we put this MD flag on here, right? So as we get to that breakpoint of MD, basically it removes all the styles from these Bootstrap classes, and it says just make it one entire row. Okay, so if I were to remove the MD, this would never collapse. It would just stay in 2 columns. So if we look at this example on our page, see it automatically stacks. But if I moved, let's say I took the MD off of these, just to show you, just made them column 3s, they would stay in their columns, even if the text overlaps the columns. And that doesn't look great for responsive design, for mobile design, right? So we're going to keep those MDs in there, and they'll stack automatically. Okay, so just a little explanation of how Bootstrap is working. But all that to say, we're looking good in terms of getting this pushed over a little bit. But the problem is we want this like vertically centered, right? We want this vertically centered. And vertical centering is not the easiest thing to do. But with Bootstrap and with Flexbox, it's a little bit easier. So as I described in the last video, and I'll describe again here briefly, basically Flexbox requires you to have at least one child to a parent. So let's just go over that really quickly. So again, this entire section with this big image and this text, interesting tagline goes here. This is all inside of one div called hero. So hero is our parent, and our child now is this div class offset MD1, call MD6. Okay, so this is a parent with one child. So if we set display flex on the parent, what that does is it defaults the setup into stacking children elements next to each other in columns. So that's a little bit confusing, but let's just trust me on this. So we'll set the hero to display flex, and that doesn't do anything. But what we can do once we set a container or a parent container to display flex is we can center things and move things around. We did this with the navigation bar. So if we set this to display flex and we vertically align this to the center, we should be able to push it down. So Bootstrap has a class called align items, and then we can set how we want to align the items. I want to center them. So basically we're saying on this container, any child of this container hero, which is our text here, any child should be aligned center. So if we save it and refresh, you can see we're looking great now, right? We're centered up vertically, okay? So we're looking closer now to this. The other thing is we probably want to do this rhombus thing in the background. So let's try that. If you've never used Color Note before, Color Note's a great app. I think you can add it on to both your Mac or your Windows machine, but it's just a dropper, and then you can grab the actual hex codes. Okay, so I'll just read out the hex codes to you guys because obviously you don't have this installed right now. But we're going to grab that green, and what we're going to do is we're going to learn a little bit about positioning now. So what's interesting is we want this rhombus or this diamond-shaped thing to go behind our text here, right? We want it to go behind our text. But the only way we can achieve that is using what's called absolute positioning. So let's start without absolute positioning, and let's just add, before our tagline here, let's just add a div called div class hero rhombus, okay? And we're just going to open it and close it. So we're not going to do anything with it. We're just going to open and close it, and it's going to be blank inside, okay? We're going to put that right before our H1. And I'm going to, in my CSS, I'm going to create a comment, and I'm going to call this hero section, just so we know exactly what this is that we're working on. And I'm going to create a selector called hero rhombus. So again, to remind you, you can select any HTML element. So we're just selecting this div that has a class of hero rhombus. So again, to select a class, it's the period, and then it's the actual class name. And capitalization matters, right? So if this was capital H hero rhombus, we would have to select capital H hero rhombus, okay? So hero rhombus, we're just going to actually set a width, a fixed width, and a fixed height to make it a rectangle. So I'm just going to set this at 350 pixels. I'm not sure what it's supposed to be. And I'm going to set a background color. And I'm going to use the background color, this green here. So what we'll do is, it's, for those of you following along, A0C D56. A0C D56. That's the green we'll use. Okay? So obviously this is not going to show up behind our text. It should show up just on top of our text. So if I refresh, there it is, right? So we've got our square right now. It's not a rhombus yet. And we've got our text, but the text is just occurring right after it, right? So that's kind of how you would expect it to look, right? That's sort of the default behavior of HTML. They just appear in the order that they appear in your code, right? So what we're going to do then is we're going to use what's called the Z index to move the rhombus to the back and move the text to the front. And we're gonna achieve that by using what's called absolute positioning. And this is pretty complex. It took me quite a while to really understand how it worked. And so I'll do my best to explain it in as short of time as possible. So basically, when you position something absolutely, you take it out of the document flow, right? Meaning you basically are creating a layer on top of your document layer. So it's almost like a layer in Photoshop or something, where it's not going to be in the document flow, so it wouldn't appear before our H1. It would just be on a layer sitting, imagine a layer sitting on top of the entire website. Okay, so what we can do is, if we do simply position absolute, it will pull this out of the document flow. So I'm going to refresh and I'll show you what that means, right? So it pulled it out of the document flow, and it's just like sitting on top of it's just sitting on top of this element here. Okay. Um, the thing with absolute positioning is uh, it's positioned absolutely. It's taken out of the document flow. But oftentimes, what we want to do is we want to position it relative to some other element. And in our case, we want to position it relative to its parent container, which is this call MD6 that we created. This 50% width class. So what we want to do is, and this is a little trick too, is you can just continue to add as many classes as you want to a div as you need. So I'm going to add a class. You do that by just creating a space between each class. So I'm going to add a class called, you can call it anything you want. So this is going to be a newly created class, and I'm going to call this hero text, because inside of this div is really our hero text, right? You could call it text, you could call it top section text, you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it hero text, right? And I'm going to go back into my my CSS, and I'm going to select period for class, and then hero dash text, and then my little brackets. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to position this relative. So now our absolute positioned item is going to be positioned relative to hero text. So if I refresh, it didn't do much, but it actually did. You couldn't see it. It was so subtle. But it's going to be important anyways. So the first thing that you're probably noticing is that the absolute positioned element is on top of our text, and we want it the opposite, right? We want the text on top of the absolute positioned element. So let's use what's called z-indexes to control that. So if we've got a position, and z-index only works if you've explicitly declared a position. So we've just explicitly declared our rhombus as absolute position, and our hero text is relative position. So what we can do is we can set our rhombus to -1, and I don't have time to explain z-index. And our default for hero text is going to be z-index 0. So this should automatically push the rhombus behind the hero text. So if we refresh, it does, but it disappears. And that's because we have this declared explicitly as position relative. So since the absolute position element has a z-index, this thing needs a z-index too. So we'll do the rhombus -1, the hero text 1. And that's exactly what we want, right? So we have the square. We have the square here. Now, one thing we do want to do is we want to turn it into a rhombus, because right now it's just a square. So to do that, we're going to go to our rhombus style, and we're going to do what's called a transform, and this works only in CSS3. I think it will work across browsers, and I think it works in Edge as well, and it works in IE11. So this is pretty okay. So we can transform this, and we can do what's called a rotate. And then in our parentheses, we can do 45 degrees. So we're just going to rotate this thing 45 degrees. So we're going to tilt this 45 degrees, and it should turn into a rhombus. Very cool. Okay. So now it's not positioned properly, though, because we kind of want it centered up. And right now it's sort of defaulting to the top of its parent container. So what we can do is we can also do this little absolute position trick. And again, just follow along. I'll try to explain it, but it's a little bit complicated. but we want the absolute positioned element to be exactly 50%. We want this thing that's sitting on top to be in the middle of the absolute positioned element. So what we'll do is we can set, if you've got an absolute positioned element, you have these options for top, bottom, left, and right. So if we set the top to 0, that's the default. It shouldn't do anything. So it sets the top edge to the very top of its parent element. Okay. If we set the top, though, to 50%, it will get pushed to exactly where the halfway point is. And then what we want to do is we want to do this little trick where we add to our transform a translate on the y-axis, and we want to translate it to negative 50%. Again, I don't have time to explain all of that, but that should perfectly center it vertically. Right? So that's a way to vertically center your absolute positioned element. So translate y negative 50, top 50. Okay, and then we want to push this over all the way to the left. So I'm going to put left 0 on the absolute positioned element, and that worked. And it looks like we probably want it pushed over even more. And for now, we'll just do, you can do negative margins. We'll just do left negative 50 and see how that looks. Okay, that looks fine right there. Okay, so we'll just keep it like that for now. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to make this white, right? So let's go into our index and see. This is an H1. And so we don't want to change all H1s to make them white. So what we can do is we can use the parent element to select it, right? So if we go inside of the div hero, which is defined right here, let's change H1s, and let's change the color to white. So if I refresh that, this should turn to white, right? And that didn't change the color of other H1s. Those are still black. Okay? So we've got our rhombus, and we have our tagline, and then we have our little call to action. Okay? So we're looking better. Let's space some of this stuff out. Actually, I'll show you how to do one of these deals, right? So the name of this company has the word edge in it, and so I kind of was playing on the edges of these shapes and the edges of this diagonal hero image. Let's do that. So what we can do is we can actually add a diagonal little edge here. And the way we can do that is using CSS clip path. And there's this great website called CSS Clippy. And I really like to use this because it gives you a way to just define how you want your clip to look, and then it will give you the code. So I just went to CSS Clippy. I just Googled it. It's called Clippy CSS Clip Path Maker. I clicked parallelogram, and I just made it shaped exactly how I want it to look on my site. And then I'm just going to grab these clip path CSS code. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back into my hero because we really want to do this on the hero div. I can go back to my hero, and I'm just going to copy and paste it in. So one has the WebKit, and one is the regular clip path. This is just to work with WebKit browsers. And so if I refresh, it just clips it up. Looks great. Okay, that's cool. Let's make this rhombus a little smaller because it seems to be spilling down over the edge here. So let's make it 300 by 300 instead. Cool. All right, we're looking a little better here. What else? What else should we do? Let's move. So we've got this nav bar that kind of like sits on top of the hero image, and right now it's not sitting on top of the hero image. What we're going to do is we can do two things. The way I think the original site's designed is it's fixed to the top, so we can sort of recreate that. So let's go into our HTML and take a look at what we have. We've got a header as our parent, and inside of that parent we've got an image of our logo, and we've got our navigation bar with our menu items, right? So I think what we want to do is we want to fix this header to the top of the screen. And we can do that using positioning again. So this is our second foray into positioning. So if we go back into our style.css, I'm going to create a section before my hero section because I like to do it in the order in which it appears on the page. And I'll go header and navigation bar, just to give us an idea, a way to search and organize our CSS style sheet. So we'll go header, and then I'm going to put a class on this header called site-header, just in case I want to use the header tag again somewhere else in the site for some reason. So I'm going to do header dot, so that calls the class site-header, right? So again, the period calls the class, and then we just copy the actual class name, site-header. And what we'll do is we'll add a position element to our header, and we're going to fix it to the top. And fixing it to the top also pulls it out of the document flow, just like position absolute pulls it out of the document flow, meaning it adds a layer, and it'll just sit on top of the layer underneath it. So we'll do that, and that's perfect. It's disappeared, but we can now use z-index again, right? So what we want to do is we want to, and any position fixed, so let's get this thing, see if we can't get this thing to show up. So if I put z-index 1, the default is 0, so it was defaulting behind the hero. But if I put z-index 1 on it, it pulls it in front of the hero. Okay. So everything's good so far, but you'll notice that it sort of gets squished. And that's because if you have a fixed position element, you need to reset the width because it's not inheriting the width of its parent container any longer. And so we'll set the width back to 100%, and it should bump it all the way across again. Okay. And since we've got this thing in our container now, what's interesting too is when you pull an element out of the document flow, it doesn't conform to the margins set on the container any longer. So we probably want to, instead of making this width 100%, maybe make it 90% so that it will fit inside of our container. And we'll figure out a way to center that up. So right now we'll just leave it as it is. So we'll do width 90%, and as you can see, it's doing great to stay at the top now as you scroll. So that's position fixed. What's the next thing? Let's change these to white, and I think we made them all caps. So let's change them to white, and let's make them all caps. So these are, let's go back into our HTML. These are inside of A tags, right? And these A tags are nested into list tags, and these list tags are a part of an unordered list, and these unordered lists are part of a nav. So what we want to do is we want to select in our CSS this specific A tag, these specific A tags, but we don't want to select all A tags, right? So we could say A color white, and that would change every anchor tag to white, but we don't want that because we might have A tags that will get blended in with the white background, right? So we want to select specifically A tags inside of our navigation bar, right? So again, you can kind of read this backwards. All anchor tags inside of our navigation bar, or our nav tag, will change to white. So we'll do that, and it keeps our other tags the default color. Okay. All right, so we're looking good. That's my coffee machine. We'll let that bring. Okay. So our top section's looking much better. We just need a real logo, but our menu looks good. Our tagline looks good. Let's start to add a little bit of space. So you'll notice that like there's some margins here and margins in between these various divs. So let's space them out a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some Bootstrap classes to space things out. So what we can do is, this is our hero section. Let's move down to the next section, which starts off as a row, and it's got this enabling property management companies and some text in this row. So what we can do is we can add margins to the top and the bottom of this row. So we can do margin top, so MT dash, and then you can set this value from 0 to 5. So 0 means nothing, 1 is a little bit of margin, 2 is more, 3 is more, 4, and then 5. So I'm going to go to the max, and we'll set the margin top to 5, and that push that down. The units are in rems. I don't want to get too far into it. So just know that 5 is a lot, 1 is a little. But the reason why we would do this is it keeps it consistent, right? So if we want our margin top at 5, I probably want my margin bottom here also at 5. So I can do margin bottom, MB-5. And that pushes this down 5. Perfect. Let's space out, I'm going to space out all of these rows in the same way. So I'm going to add margin top 5, margin bottom 5 on the next row as well. So it gives it more breathing room. And I'm going to do that on the next row as well, all the way down. Margin top 5, margin bottom 5. Okay, so we're just spacing things out, giving the site a little bit of breathing room. Okay. The other thing you'll probably notice is this is in a much smaller width than our text here. Our text goes all the way to the edge. And that's because our text here, if we go back to our text here is in a col MD6, and that's great. So it will by default, any child element of the column by default will span the entire width of the column. So there's a couple options. We can create a class and we can set the width of that class to a smaller width, but then you'd have to make some changes to make it responsive, and that we don't want to have to deal with that. So there's a couple things we could do. We could just make this into a thinner column, right? We want to keep our image at 6, but we could like move this into a col MD4, right? even though it doesn't add up to 12, it's not more than 12, so we can still, it will still remain in the same row. So if we do that, this is thinner, but you'll notice that this got pushed over, right? So what happens now is this is 4 and this is 6, but there's 2 columns of spacing left, right? 6 plus 4 is 10. An entire row spans 12 columns, right? So what we can do is we can use our offset again. So if we do offset MD-2, now we're added up to 12, right? So we're going to offset this text to, we're going to make it a width of 4, and our image is still a width of 6, right? So we're going to do that, and that should bump everything over, right? So that's pretty good, but I think it's offset maybe too much, right? And so I think I'll probably want to offset this just 1 so that it's not pushed over this much. So it's only pushed over 1 column. So let's do that. So that looks better. But again, now we've got this space on the end. So as you can imagine, what we'll do is we'll add offset MD1 to our to this column. So I know it got a little confusing there, but what we're doing is we're just trying to, if we want this to go all the way to the edge, we're just trying to get it to add up to 12. So 4 plus 1 is 5, 6 plus 1 is 7. So 7 plus 5 is 12. We're spanning the entire row now, okay? Okay, so it's closer. It's not exactly how it's supposed to look, but it's closer. And then let's do the same thing to the next row. So we'll do the same thing to the next row. So in our, it starts with col MD6, and we want to keep that. And we want to change this to call MD4. So let's do that. So that's, did that work? Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. That's our image. Keep that at 6. We want our text to be called MD4. We want it to span 4. So that's perfect. And then we just need to push over our text. How many? We need to push over our text 1. Offset. Oh, we got to push it over 2. Let's try that. MD2. Okay. So that's better, but I don't like it all the way to the edge. I kind of want it in the middle. Because the way this is sitting is it's got 1 column on each side. So let's change this to offset MD1. Okay, so now it's got 1 bit of space on each side. Okay, looks good. I'm trying to think what else we can do. We can do, let's do the little rhombus things again. As a way to introduce color, right? So I introduced the orange here and the red here. And we're going to do a similar deal to what we did. You know what? We'll save that for the next video. We'll save that for the next video. So let's leave it there. I think we're getting closer to our final destination. So in the next video, what we'll do is we'll finish out the design, and then we will work on responsive, mobile responsive. So you'll notice that this doesn't look perfect. It's okay, but some of the order of elements are wrong, and so we'll talk about how to make this work for you responsively. All right, until next time.